is the question of identity, and often the identity of Roee Rosen. Who is Roee Rosen, and how do you describe his work?
Well, I think that the question that you just asked is perhaps one of the central questions of European art and literature in the past 500 years. So when Rembrandt is doing a self-portrait, he's giving an answer, the same with Van Gogh. And when Jean-Jacques Rousseau writes his Confessions, he's doing the same. They're painting a picture that is supposed to be trustworthy of an identity. And I believe I'm part of this project, but I belong to a sect of skepticists who try to complicate notions of identity and see it as something that is less cohesive and less integral and more plural and more flexible. So it may sound like a professorial, theoretical answer, but it is actually the way I feel, you know, that we are not one. We have many voices and many fragments in our identity. And even though the identity is real, the account I'm trying to give of it is more complex. It is also one more thing that I can say, that, and again it would be heavy and it would sound theoretical, but I think it's quite simple, is that we often think of ourselves in relation to the other in terms of opposition, you know, masculine and feminine, Israeli Jew and Palestinian, you know, foreigner and local. And my attempt is really to look for liminal zones, for zones where those identities are not denied, but they somehow converge or conflate and get into a dialogue. So often in my work there are realizations of those dichotomies being defied or denied.
It has to do with this idea of limits and borders, or not borders, it's not the best word maybe, liminal zones, as you say. We also find the limit of representation, I think, no? In some of your different works. How far can we go? How much can we show?
You're right. I mean, I think that the question of what is representation and where does one put the limit is a question that I'm perpetually dealing with, and it will be good perhaps to give a few concrete examples. You know, can one represent terror? Can one represent or conceive of human sentiments towards Adolf Hitler or someone else that we construe as an absolute evil? Can one think outside of, you know, one's gender? These are all questions that I'm trying in different ways to fantasize or speculate, you know, offer speculative situations where these things are examined. And it often has a sense of, you know, either vulgarity or something disturbing or something that should not be done. But I'm always my first victim, you know, it's always, the scandal is always against myself, and I'm the one who's implicated in it. And that may not always be a good defense, but that's the defense that I have, you know, that there is always a mechanism of self-incrimination. So the position is not like a sanctimonious position of a preacher or a priest or someone who knows right from wrong, but rather the questions are being performatively presented. So, and hopefully it extends to the viewer as well, you know, that you find yourself in a situation where you're lured into something that is beautiful and funny and seductive and you know, and alluring, but it's like a trap, like a honey trap, and you're faced with difficult situations and questions.
You have mentioned this self-incrimination, that sometimes you are the victim yourself. This makes me think of the questioning of sadomasochism and possession, with there's a victim or not, or these roles that get twisted from time to time. And I think that it's really interesting how you relate this with politics, in the sense that it's always a matter of power relations.
Right. I mean, I think that the body is always political. I think that whatever we do, there is always a level of power relations, ideology that is inscribed in whatever surrounds us and in our depth, in ourselves. And I think that this becomes clearer sometimes in sexuality and erotics. And with sadomasochism, it often becomes really performed, because a lot of sadomasochism is about explicitly pursuing those situations of control and submission. And there can be very confusing moments. Like I remember when the horrible pictures from Abu Ghraib came out, the Iraqi prison where American soldiers were torturing and abusing Iraqi prisoners. It looked like sadomasochistic pornography, but in fact it was like the opposite of the opposite. It was like the return of the thing that sadomasochism, when it's done properly and sensitively, tries to undo, to unravel. So these are very tricky territories, where sometimes it's a slippery slope. It's not clear when self-reflection is there and when is it just, pure narcissism or fetishism. But I am trying to do it in a way that would clearly have a level of, irony and maybe even some distancing devices that would make it clear that this is not, a simple case of, trying to satisfy a desire, but rather a staging of something that is complex and can lead us to insights about ourselves, about politics.
I would like to ask you for the music. Music in your work. Musicians inhabit the space as other characters. How do you so organically think of the music world?
It's a great point. I mean, music is really very, very crucial in my work, and much of it I think is almost dialectical in opposition to the way that I see music being used in cinema, which is often like makeup. It's like there is a thriller, so there will be a tremolo of violins, or there is a romantic resolution, so the violins would be sweet, and or someone is following someone, there will be heartbeats. So it's like very vulgar indexical signs that gives us instructions how should we feel at this particular moment. And for me it is important to have music be a substantive image, in the film. And somehow from the very beginning my thought was that this should also mean that the musicians are there, And often they even take the place of actors or performers. Like, for instance, in the Dust Channel, there are no other performers but the musicians who actually perform the music. It's also very... I was really fortunate to work with a musician that I really love, Igor Kotogolov. And it's a great way to create a dialogue, which is sometimes argumentative, between myself, because I have my own notions of what I want to do musically, and he has his own ideas. But it's a great, I was so accustomed to do everything myself. I was initially a painter and a writer, so it's a very solitary work and very monomaniacal as well. And in cinema in general, there is something collaborative, and particularly with people that you work very closely with, like the cinematographer, who's actually the eye, the musician, who's actually provides the music, which for me, as I said, is absolutely an important image. So it's almost like a relationship. There's a high level of trust and involvement and dialogue. And then it varies, from one piece to the next, what exactly music should do. Like, to go back to the Dust Channel, the music is, on the one hand, it's absolute, it's an operetta. So everything, all the scenery is based on the music. The music is there first. And at the same time, it provides the film an opportunity to act almost like a silent film, because all the sound comes from the music. There is no Foley, there is no dialogue. So it's a way in which music can really reshape the cinematic machinery, you know. That's really what I find it magical, you know, that something like this can still happen after so many years of, you know, filmmaking, that those basic relationships can be somehow reestablished. That's, yeah.
You mentioned that you were a painter and a writer, and so yeah, your work is a melange of many disciplines.
Yeah.
You mentioned also operetta, television, advertising. How is that? I can imagine that it depends on the work, but in general, how is this working process?
I mean, there are two issues here. I think that first of all, you're absolutely right. My work is a hybrid, and that's because I feel like a hybrid. There are artists or specialists, like, you know, painters who only paint abstraction, only paint a specific kind of abstraction. And there is a lot of ideology that goes to that as well in modernism. You know, Clement Greenberg, it's a very important American art theorist, was all about separating the mediums. The painting has to be pure, writing has to be pure. So I'm about impurity. That's the first, and I felt like that even as a child. You know, I was doing, when I was very young, I was doing comics. Comics is both images and words. And then in the pragmatic level of doing the art, the question is always asked afresh, you know, from the beginning. So when there is a new project, I often find myself in a state of confusion or unknowing, you know, what would be the realization, what the medium might be. Sometimes surprises come along, you know, years into the process. Like, for example, I spent almost a decade working on Justine Frank, this fictive Jewish-Belgian pornographer and writer. And actually writing her pornographic novel only happened, you know, years into the project, after so many things have been realized already. Also, strangely, it began with the thought of a film. I gave up the film, thinking that I cannot do it, I don't have the competence. And then, 7 years later, I did a short film. So, in retrospect, it looks very organized, you know, and thought out, and but often there is chaos in the process.